Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. I'm joined today by Jim Holland, who's worked for decades in the aviation space, both in the military and commercial sides of that world. And we speak about safety and risk in that context. It's a really interesting sector with lots going on, particularly when we think about the military aspect of this and balancing operational delivery and keeping people safe is a really interesting predicament to overcome. So we talk about that. We also speak about risk appetite. We speak about what the aviation industry does well, and there are some really great gems of ideas and principles to take from this, and also areas in which it can improve. We touch on technology, so AI, pilotless planes as well. So a really wide-ranging conversation, and I'm sure you'll get some great stuff from it. Just wanted to say, Jim's here in his personal capacity as a safety professional to speak about his background. He's not, as you'll hear from the conversation, speaking about what he's up to now in any way, shape, or form. But we're trying to get his perspectives, insights, stories, and the value that he can bring from this really in-depth knowledge he's got of this particularly interesting space, and see what we can learn from that to take away and implement in our daily lives, keeping people safe and well. So, with that said, I hope you enjoy this conversation with myself and Jim, and I'll see you on the other side of the credits. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Jim.
It's a pleasure, Christian.
You've got a really interesting background, which I'm really looking forward to delving into, and hopefully, those in the audience will learn something from the experiences you've had. And I suppose where I was keen to start was from an emotive perspective. Kind of, how does it feel to bear that kind of weight of responsibility of overseeing safety for, I think, what was it, 1,800 or so pilots? When they're engaged in a really important yet obviously quite treacherous potentially job.
So you're obviously talking about my time in the military there. So yeah, it was an interesting time within the military when I got involved in safety. It wasn't what I started off doing, but the military went through a voyage of discovery where they started to be regulated where they were never regulated before, and this is flying aviation, military aviation. And they went from being a military organization without regulations, just doing their normal business, to having to be regulated and work within as a regulated community. And as I said, it was a voyage that I was on, not quite from the beginning, but from fairly early on. And it was a very interesting time to see how an organization that were effectively allowed to function without too much oversight because of the work that they did, to having to work in quite a tight, regulated manner, but balancing that from doing something which is inherently dangerous. Aviation is a dangerous activity anyway. You then start putting a military perspective on that, and it has lots and lots of risks associated with it. But you also have a job to do, and you need to make sure that the risks are managed in a way that doesn't really curtail you doing your job. So it was a massive balancing act, really, to balance between operational output and doing things as safely as you possibly could, given the different situations you were going to be in.
And thinking about a sector like manufacturing, let's say, where there's always this kind of tension, but it can be a positive tension between productivity and obviously safety. And that sounds to me like it was a an even more extreme version of that, I suppose. Um, so how did you deal with that? Was that a difficult thing to deal with, or did you just kind of focus
The-
on what you needed to do and kind of block the rest of it out? Or
no, that was thought through in quite a lot of detail, which meant that there was a big split between what you did when you were just doing normal training at home base back in the UK or other operations, and what you did when you were out in operational theatres. And there was a different way of managing the activities and the risks when you did that, which the risk management process of that was effectively it still was retained by the hierarchy at home base, but the person who was in charge of delivering the military effect had an input into this.
mm,
And there was always a discussion that was had between the operational commander and the peacetime commander, as it were, who was charged with managing the safety.
mm,
And so there was a formal agreement between the two people to make sure that the operational effect could be done. There
yeah,
were issues where something might need to be done quickly, and there were processes in place that allowed that rapid decision making to happen, and then the safety considerations to be addressed slightly later than that. But those
mm,
processes were well defined, thought out beforehand, which allowed maximum flexibility when you were delivering operational effect.
mm. And the kind of oversight and regulation, was that a sort of UK government thing, or was that a kind of international treaty thing, or what was that?
No, the way that it was set up, it was set up within the UK government. So the Secretary of State for Defence was the top man, as it were. It was all done from the regulatory organisation was internal to the military, staffed by military people,
Mhm.
but the people at the top of that organisation sat outside of the direct military chain of command and went
Right.
directly to the Secretary of State. So it gave this, whilst you're still using the same manpower effectively, it allowed the people within the regulation regulator to operate independently, working directly for the Secretary of State, which
Mm.
allowed you to have the same people doing the same job, but had different chains of command, which means that they were working to two different masters at two different times, which allowed that level of independence.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because you sort of, as an outsider, would kind of not think of regulation as being a challenge. My perception would have been that it was, just all internally managed and sort of get on with it as best you can, kind of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, it the regulation was based a little bit on the civil aviation regulations,
Mm.
so that's where it comes from. But obviously, it needed to be adapted for a
Yeah.
military context.
Yeah.
Um, I think the benefit it had that we started from nothing, and so it was designed and evolved to suit the regulated community rather than the regulator, but the two working hand in hand during the development of it.
Mm. Mm. Okay, no, that's very, very interesting. And you've obviously flown yourself. You're a helicopter man, aren't you? If I'm
Yeah,
right
that's
in saying?
correct. Yeah, spent
Yeah.
10 years flying helicopters.
Mm. And what's that like? I mean, I've never done that, and it feels like much more much greater burden, I guess. From the perspective of safety of yourself and people that are with you and other people doing that than driving a car. Obviously, bad things happen in cars as well. But I mean, how does that feel, and how was that sort of to grapple with that?
You you are trained very, very well. It is incredibly professional in the way that you go right from day one of your training all the way through. And even when you are doing it as a day job, the oversight and the training is really, really professional.
Mm,
So you just get indoctrinated into it, really. So you don't even think that what you're doing is dangerous.
mm,
but you're always conscious that things go wrong, and things did go wrong, which made it a really live topic for discussion, and it was always there at the front of your mind that sort of that things go wrong, and when things go wrong, they go wrong pretty badly, and people die,
Mm.
and it happens a lot less frequently than it used to happen, but it still used to happen frequently enough that it was always there in the forefront of everybody's minds when you were doing the job.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's really interesting because you've kind of got the military mindset, and then there's also this kind of aviation mindset, and the two kind of crossing. And I suppose you're um, in both. You can have one or the other, can't you? And there's those risks that you need to kind of manage and contend with. But then if you put the two together, then obviously you're sort of combining that, which it must be quite a sort of fascinating world to work in, but also I suppose challenging from that kind of mentality perspective.
Yeah, then you were. I mean, it was compartmentalized to some extent.
Mm,
Sometimes you were doing things that were purely military, and you had very little interaction with the civilian population. But
mm,
when you're flying around, I mean, a lot of the airspace there is open airspace, and you can be flying next to airliners operating in and out of civilian airfields. So
mm,
you have to abide by their rules and regulations, and you are just another user of the air. The fact that you're flying a military aircraft matters here or not.
mm,
You take that to a war zone, and it's a completely different game, and you are operating in a different manner.
mm,
And you just have to put a different hat on depending on the environment that you're operating in on a given day.
mm. Yeah, yeah, makes sense. So, what would you say the differences that you've observed are between, I suppose, risk appetite within the kind of military aviation space and the kind of private civilian, whatever the right word is, aviation space? Are there kind of differences in that risk appetite?
I mean, I don't like risk appetite as a concept really.
Yeah.
It's there are risks, and risks are explored, they're assessed, and then you make the decision on whether to proceed with the activity based on the outcome. Just
Mm,
because you're doing something that is inherently dangerous doesn't mean you're going to throw the rule book out the window and just go for it anyway.
no.
Almost you have to evaluate that even more. Um, I would get people asking me what's the risk appetite of somebody so we can operate in a different way, and I would always say, well, it's risk appetite is not a personal thing. It's based on the
Mm,
context, and you then have to assess what the context is, assess the pros and cons, what's the benefits, what's the negatives, and then make a decision based on those criteria.
mm,
Um, Risk appetite should not be a personal thing. Somebody shouldn't be more risky or risk averse than another person.
mm,
Although you tend to find that when someone is doing a risk assessment, either formally or informally, some people will accept more risk
yeah.
than other people will. But that it should be a judgment rather than a personal decision.
Yeah. And based on the organization and their goals and their um, aspirations and what they do and their history and have things gone wrong before and so on. Because it strikes me as an outsider that aviation um, is, just because of what it does, very safety conscious. To think of it in a different way. You've got big tubes of metal carrying goods or people and doing what are really extraordinary things, although, they are day-to-day things if you're working in that space. But it does strike me that that sector is more conscious about safety than perhaps other sectors are.
It is. I think because the consequences of something going wrong are far
Yeah.
higher. But
Mm,
it wasn't until I stepped outside of aviation that I realized that how well people within inside the aviation community actually managed risks. I mean, even before in the military, before it was regulated, it was the risks were not so much formally assessed, but it was always there. We we invented checklists, human factors, crew resource management, all of that stuff sort of came out of NASA aviation, and going into the airlines, and it's been built into the sector for decades.
Mm,
And it's other sectors that have looked at how the aviation community go about their business, and adopted some of their practices. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of healthcare, the way that has changed, taking lessons from how basic operations are managed,
mm,
and all of the little procedures that people go through, um, buddy checks to make sure that it's not just down to one person reading a checklist rather than memorizing a checklist, even down to the way that a cockpit is designed with noises and colors, the human machine interface, just to make sure that people aren't making human error, and
mm.
trying to design out human error as best you can. And it's something that the aviation community has been doing ever since the Wright brothers took to the air.
Mm.
Um, and I just thought that's how everybody functioned. And it
That's how it
wasn't
was.
until
Yeah. Mm,
I stepped out of that and realized that how haphazard a lot of the other organizations and industries and sectors are,
mm.
compared to the way that aviation goes about its business. But I suppose, as I said, the consequences are significantly higher, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of why I was keen to have a chat because I thought actually it's something that I feel the audience would benefit from hearing about. How's it done and what are the mindsets and the principles and the checks and the balances and but also I suppose balance. The counterbalancing of we still need innovation and we still need to progress and we're doing really interesting things and we've got to the operation has to happen and we've got to do it safely, but we can't stop things that should be happening because of safety. So yeah, so I think it's a really, really fascinating sector. How do you sort of guard against sort of being a bit blasé about maybe the more kind of attritional day to day, less significant in terms of harm risks when you are, as you say, doing something very, very high risk potentially?
When you step out of the cockpit, you can get a little bit frustrated with some of the less significant areas that people seem to be concerned with. Um, I personally had big problems when I came back from um, being deployed into operational theatres like Iraq and Afghanistan, where you were dealing with life and death on a daily, hourly basis, and then you'd come back to sleepy little UK, and you saw what people were getting hot under the collar about, and you just were thinking, this really isn't important.
Mm,
This is fairly insignificant, and you get used to it. You come back, you reset where you are, but it takes a few weeks to reset back to understanding what other people are bothered about, um, when your threshold has been so high, that the little things really don't matter.
mm,
And it takes a time to adjust to get back into that mindset, definitely.
mm, mm. Is it that because what strikes me from what you've said so far is you're trained and you're drilled and you're so process driven and everything's thought through. So is it would it be fair to say that those sort of littler things, smaller things are just sort of so well managed? It's not that they're not kind of significant, but it's just that they're so well managed and thought through that you don't have to worry about it. And obviously, you're doing something that is much bigger at the same time. Um, so is it sort of that process? The fact that it's kind of been so well managed that sort of negates it so much, or a little bit, or is it just that the sheer weight of what you're doing is totally different?
I think it's probably the latter rather than the former. Um, you Even when you are away in operational theatres, people will trip over things,
Yeah.
and you probably find that the majority of majority of incidents will happen where somebody has just had what will assume to be a normal occupational health injury caused by a wire that somebody hasn't put a cable
Yeah.
protector over and things like that. It's just that on the scale of what's actually happening, if you think in a normal workplace, a death is thankfully very, very rare. Whereas when you're in operational theatre, I mean, at times can be commonplace, unfortunately,
Yeah. Mm.
which means that somebody spraining an ankle it just fades into the noise at that stage.
Yeah.
Um, just because you've got more of the higher level stuff
Mm.
happening.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that those things should be ignored and shouldn't be managed. And you certainly find that with the operations that the UK's been involved in, where they start off as new and novel and pretty unfounded, but because we've stayed in some places for a
Mm.
number of years, it gets quite normalized quite quickly. And you find that you want to go out for a run in the evening, and if you're not doing that with a day glow jacket and a head torch on, someone is going to pull you over. And whereas at the beginning of an operation, when you go out, um, well, people don't even go running because it's too dangerous.
Yeah. 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 Makes sense. Um, Given it's such a regulated industry, as you say, how do you kind of manage that risk, but still? And I suppose this is thinking about the aviation sector broadly rather than military, but still kind of innovate, still progress, still change and improve things, but kind of still balance it off with compliance.
Continually learning is something that is done very well. You start off every time you go flying, you plan what you're going to do. Uh, you then get the crew together and you will have a brief before you go out. You do your mission, you come back, and then you go straight into a debrief. It normally starts off with any safety points that people come up, and it can be quite a harsh debrief process. Um, the gloves come off, and everyone tells exactly how it is. And if there are lessons that are to be learned, they get shared, they get passed around. When I was flying, it wasn't so much a formal process. It was very much a sort of you'd go into the bar at the end of the day and you'd chat about it, and lessons got disseminated in that way, and people would learn that way. Later on in my career, it got more formalized with a proper reporting system where people could actually share and report incidents as you can in most organizations now. So it's always been an organization where you learn from your mistakes,
Mm.
because you might get away with it one day, but if you don't get away with it, it can be quite catastrophic, and you want to make sure that people know about it.
Mm.
So it's always been an open and honest environment, and it's hard to hide, and people will tell it as it is,
Mm.
and no one's afraid of doing it either.
Yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think that kind of culture. Have you ever come across the book called Extreme Ownership by the US Navy SEAL?
I haven't, no.
Okay, that's
No.
it's really interesting. It's all about basically taking responsibility, but also, as you say, it's that culture of being open and frank and candid, which you don't often see in other sectors, shall we say? Is that something that is hard to um, to get and to keep, or is it just so ingrained? And is it hard for somebody coming, say, from coming into that world who isn't used to that? I suppose. I guess if you started there and you're trained that way, it's just what you do. But would it be hard to come into that environment? Do you think?
It's one of those environments where you don't just come into it. I mean, most
Mm.
people will join straight out of their school or higher education straight into the organization. So they are, I wouldn't say indoctrinated, but they don't come with any baggage.
Yeah.
And you just the culture has always been good because people who are selected to go to the military are selected by people who are already in the military,
Mm.
and they will select you because they know the kind of people that will fit in. You find that most of your friends that you make in the military remain friends for life.
Yeah.
Um, there is great camaraderie. Everybody is fairly similar. Whereas I have noticed you go into a a non-military organization where people are joining from other disciplines, other types of organization, and it's a lot harder to have that or to grow a culture because everyone comes with their own background
Mm.
and their own baggage, as it were, really.
Yeah.
And it's a lot harder, and you see a lot more bad behaviors going on.
Mm.
Um, Whereas in the military, it's not like that. The culture is there,
Yeah.
and you just fit in with that culture from day one.
Yeah. And is the sort of in the commercial aviation space, is that culture similar, or is it sort of not quite so? I don't know if good is the right word, but you know what I'm saying when I say good in this sense.
I mean, you tend to find, I think, certainly in the commercial world, a lot of the commercial pilots will have a military background anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think you will generally find that you will have a military community and a non-military community, but because they are all doing a very similar job, that it does have a definitive culture that
Mm.
is a strong culture. Um, and it also helps that it's a very process-driven industry. So
Mm.
everybody is doing things in exactly the same way. So there is not that much ability for free thinking. You have to follow the rules, you have to follow the processes because that's how it's done. And that's
Mm.
not just within one organization, that's across all organizations within the aviation sector.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also a sector where um, as you said earlier, you're sharing the airspace between military and commercial, but you're also having to work with people from across the globe as well. So I suppose you have to have this kind of um, it's an assumption, but I suppose there has to be a sort of there was almost an aviation culture, is there, where you can be doing these things with working alongside people from different countries, different backgrounds, and you're kind of speaking a common language in a sense.
Yeah, I mean it's not even a common language. I mean it's English. That is
Yeah,
the
right.
language of aviation.
Mm.
And you will find that you will have cultural differences, as in national cultural differences in the way that certain airlines will operate. But a lot of these airlines now are quite diluted with people migrating all around the world to fly for different airlines. But
Mm.
you would tend to find, as far as a global organization, the aviation community, they all do things very, very similarly. Even from a regulatory perspective, FAA regulations are not particularly dissimilar from UKCAA regulations,
Right.
which are not dissimilar from European EASA regulations.
Mm.
So and you have to because you can take off in one country, one continent, and land in another
Yeah.
continent. You cannot have to take a European chip out and put a North American chip in when you fly across the Atlantic. Everything has
No.
to be done exactly the same. So
Mm.
it is globally similar.
Mm. Mm. And what about in the sort of military world? Between say the RAF and say in the Middle East. Well, I think you've done some work as well. Because obviously you're then probably less cooperating with others. It's more kind of you're doing your thing. But how similar are the cultures, and how uh, challenging or otherwise is it to sort of implement the kind of same mindset um, around safety and culture and so on and so forth?
It again, it I suppose it's similar and different in a way that you have the aviation community or the military community who all operate to relatively standard ways. I mean, there are differences between sort of an Eastern Bloc Russian doctrine and a Western type doctrine as well, and the way where they go about their business. But
Mm.
essentially, militaries are all made up of the same building blocks. They all have the same objectives, and they all use similar methods to achieve those objectives as well. So that there is a common theme running across that, but then you have to then put on your national culture, and you where you might have a sort of a very high power ratio, so high to low power, where there is the senior leadership have got a lot more power, and there's a lot more reverence to the senior leadership in some countries, where it's a lot flatter in other countries. So you
Mm.
will find there will be national cultural differences in the way that they go about business, but generally the underlying military principle remains similar between the different countries.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's very, very interesting. Because if you think about again other industries and what they could learn from aviation and both sides of that aviation world, it strikes me when I meet people from around the world that there are such vast differences in how people think about safety and risk and compliance and cooperation, and so it's really quite impressive that it has kind of that there's this kind of sinuous view, I suppose, that's developed.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there are certainly differences. I mean, something I witnessed in the Middle East was a reporting culture, and that people are a lot more suspicious of a report, putting a report in. Not many reports were submitted because people were afraid of putting reports in, because they there is still very much a blame culture out there.
Right.
Um, I almost see it that the way that certainly within the UK, and I think probably Northern European, North American cultures have developed, is a lot more into the with a just culture principles, whether they're applied or not. They certainly talk about it,
Mm.
um, and encourage the fact that people, well, acknowledge the fact that people are human and people make mistakes, and you cannot punish someone for making a mistake, and it's a great opportunity to learn from something.
Mm.
Whereas other cultures that I've worked with, there is very much, well, to solve this problem, we need to find someone to blame. We need to publicly punish that person, and that will stop anybody else making the same mistake that they've made.
Mm.
And it just, whether that's because we are in the West in a more mature way of our thinking, maybe that's being a little bit arrogant, but it's certainly a different way of addressing the way that um, errors are addressed.
Mm.
Um, Looking back, I mean, you see back in sort of our 70s, 80s, I think even in the UK, we had very much a blame culture. And
Yeah.
as long as you could find somebody who did something wrong, blame them, problem was solved, go away, nothing to see here.
Mm.
Whereas now, I think it's certainly not as good as it could be, but we very much try to look for the understanding of why did that person do their what forced them to do their action in the first place.
Mm.
It probably wasn't the fact that they weren't concentrating. It was, there will be deeper organizational issues. Were they set up for failure? All that kind of stuff that needs to be investigated and looked into, rather
Mm.
than just stopping your investigation at the individual who was at the scene of the accident at the time.
Yeah, yeah. But we have definitely made strides in that regard. I think what's interesting there is that I mean, in my world, um, there still seems to be quite a rush to blame the person that fell over. Um, Whereas I think, you know, something that's more complicated and higher profile, I do think, that there's much more chance that we would look at that in a kind of dispassionate way and not jump to that blame. So I think there's still, yeah, as you say, we've made progress, but there's still certainly work to be done.
or a huge amount of work to be done. I
Mm,
think we're only at the tip of the iceberg on this one.
mm,
At least we're talking about the right things,
yeah.
and at least if you're talking about the right things, and your safety policy says that you have got a just culture, and that is displayed somewhere, uh, it's then down to the organisation to demonstrate that it walks the walk as well as talks the talk. But no, I still see it. We just need someone to blame.
Mm, yeah. Not 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 the best way. Not the best
It's
way.
easy. It's
Yeah,
easy.
but it's
It's
easy.
simple.
Yeah.
It doesn't involve any brain power. You can get it
Mm,
solved very quickly. Move on. Nothing to see here.
mm, yeah. And we are as humans attuned to looking for a simple solution, aren't we? Sometimes.
We're like
Um,
water.
yeah.
We are. Yeah.
Yeah.
It,
So we've spoken about quite a lot of the ways in which the aviation sector is, doing a good job when it comes to safety, risk management. Where would you see perhaps, one or two areas that, you know, that there's room for improvement or more room for improvement in the sector?
I think there's a lot of regulatory complications.
Hmm.
Um, the regulations are not as straightforward as they possibly could be. They do change quite frequently. Um, and and I sometimes think that they they are not there to help. Um, they are there to police,
Mm,
which and it's not across the board. And I really think that sort of the organisations and the regulators need to be working hand in hand, um, to make sure that the regulations support what the organisations are doing, but also the regulators do need to make sure that it doesn't become the Wild West.
mm,
Um, but policing for the sake of policing doesn't really help. And I think the way that the regulations are written sometimes isn't as clear as it can be. It's better in some countries than other countries I've seen, but I think simplifying regulations, and making them accessible, is something that would benefit everybody.
mm,
When I was in the military and they formed the Military Aviation Authority, um, they started with a blank book. There were no regulations there. Um, it was written by people who had done the job in the first place. And I found that they were a really good set of regulations. They were easy to find. They were clearly written. No regulation. I mean, there were some regulations that were 10 pages long. Most regulations are 2 or 3 pages long. You could pick it
yeah.
up, you could read it, you could understand it, you know what you had to comply with, you know what the acceptable means of compliance were, and you could just get up and go and do your job. And
Mm,
it made I I thought, and not everybody would agree with me, but I thought they were a well well written set of regulations that helped the operators perform their duties and provided guidance.
mm,
I think that's because they had a blank, as I said, a blank page to start with, rather than other regulations which have been around for decades and have just evolved over time. And to go back to square one and rewrite them would be impractical, and probably
mm,
impossible. And so they've been adapted. They're certainly better than they were, but
yeah.
it's a lot harder to do it when you're working with something that is already enshrined.
Mm, mm. Last couple of things I wanted to touch on. What would you say are the biggest sort of technological trends that are going to be affecting this space? And sort of, what are we seeing now, and how do you kind of see this developing over the next, say, 5 to 10 years? And what changes is that going to make in terms of these topics that we've been speaking about today?
And AI is going to be massive. Um, we don't know what it's going to bring. Um, we're starting to use it a little bit, but it's such a powerful tool. For regulations, for instance, large language models, typing a question into, I mean, even AI at its basic level, Chat GPT,
Mm.
you can you could put a regulation in there and just get it to pull out the salient points. And I know there are a lot of naysayers out there saying you can't trust it and it's just going to provide you without thinking about things. My view is that use it as an assistant. Um, it can do the initial work for you. It can really speed up processes. Um, it can provide you with a really good basis to start where you need to do your intellectual work going forward. I've seen it. I mean, as I said, just using basic online open source chat GPT type stuff, but then the companies who are then introducing that into different ways of doing a risk assessment. So
Mm.
rather than getting 7 people sat in a room for 3 hours using the brain power of those 7 people, you can do it online where it could be like sitting in an audience of 40,000 people, getting everybody to chip in at the same time and provide their inputs to it, and then distilling that down into something that's really useful. I think it's going to be it is going to be a game changer. We don't know where it's going to go, but it's massive in
Mm.
all parts of from a safety professional's perspective. I use it all the time,
Mm.
um, and I'm finding I'm using it more and more, almost on a weekly basis for things that I'm doing. It's,
Yeah.
as I said, it's an absolute game changer.
Mm. And what about so in um, delivery vans and things like that? We're now thinking about driverless vehicles. We've got the DLR in London with which it's not technically driverless, but it's kind of driverless notionally. Um, is that something I mean, there are drones and things, aren't there, that are involved in the military now? But I mean, are we thinking that there might be commercial transatlantic flights with no pilots and no crew, and it's all going to be um, done sort of virtually or robotically? Is that sort of within the realm of
Though
possibility?
the planes fly themselves, they you you could basically take an aircraft from Heathrow to JFK without touching the controls. If you program things incorrectly, um, it will take a social mindset change to have an aeroplane without a human being sat at the front of it.
Mm.
But a little bit like, as you said, things like the DLR, just having certainly within aviation, if you look at human why aeroplanes crash, vast majority of issues that occur with aeroplanes is because a human being has interfered with a very, very clever airplane in the wrong way.
Mm.
And had they not interfered or done something, the plane would have been fine going forward. Air France 447 is a classic example of that. Um, it's it's happening already. Um, these things are incredibly clever,
Mm.
um, and it's just a matter of time. Trains dead easy, I think, just because of the way that they literally run on rails.
Yeah.
Planes very much so. Cars is going to be harder because of the way the environment they operate in and all the other interactions that happened with sort of other
Proximity.
vehicles on
Yeah.
the road,
Mm.
people, various things that could come into it. It'll come. It will be
Mm.
something. The early adopters. It takes people like Elon Musk to sort of have that vision to say this is where we're going to be going and
Mm.
starting to drive it forward. Yeah,
Yeah.
taking human beings out of these loops will make it safer in the long run.
Mm.
There will be problems um, as we go on that journey. There will be naysayers, but technology time will progress and it will happen. And it'll happen in our lifetime.
Yeah. Good stuff. That's something to look forward to. So wrapping up then, Jim, wondered if you could just give maybe one, two, three I suppose, insights, lessons, perspectives on your career and the sector that you've been working in, and what are the sort of key points that people in other sectors could learn and take away from the conversations today and your experiences and sort of benefit from in their jobs.
Learning from experience, learning from when things go wrong, learning from when other people make mistakes, learning from when things happen to other people, sharing those experiences, and treating those experiences as positives rather than negatives. I think it's the best way to learn. If things go right all the time, you're not going to learn, and two, you're also not going to innovate and improve. It's essential, and I think that if we embrace it rather than treat it as something that's wrong, embracing it is the mother of invention, and we need to learn from people's mistakes. We will continue to do it, and without making these mistakes, we will fail to innovate. We'll fail to improve.
And be open and be willing to talk about them. It's one of the key things that I took from what you said earlier as well.
Very much so. I mean, and that comes down from having the trust within an organization to be able to do that, with not hiding things. And if people start talking about things and it's then seen as a positive things, more people will talk about it. And the more people talk, the more people learn, the more we innovate, the quicker we move. And it's a positive.
Yeah, definitely. Love that. Thank you very much. If people want to connect or learn more, what's the best way of doing that with you?
LinkedIn is probably my one social media platform that I actually interact with. So yeah, I'm on LinkedIn.
Good stuff. All right, great. Well, really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. I think got some great perspective. So appreciate your time, and thanks very much for joining me today.
No, Christian, thank you for inviting me on. It's been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you for joining Jim and I, and we'll see you again on the next episode. Cheers.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.